They say power protects those who hold it, that a crown is more than just a symbol. It is a shield, a barrier between the ruler and the chaos beneath them, a guarantee that no matter how dangerous the world becomes, the one who wears it will always remain untouchable. But history has a way of lying, because sometimes the most dangerous place in the world is not the battlefield, it is the throne room. And on that night, inside the cold stone walls of the royal palace, the queen finally understood that truth. If you think you know how this story ends, you don't, because what the queen did next was never meant to be remembered. The palace was quiet, not the kind of quiet that brings peace, but the kind that feels unnatural, heavy, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. Torches flickered along the long corridors, casting shadows that moved just slightly too slowly, stretching across marble floors like silent observers. Guards stood at their posts, unmoving, their faces hidden behind discipline. Servants passed through the halls without speaking, their footsteps softer than usual, as if they had been instructed not to disturb the silence. Everything felt controlled, deliberately so. And the queen noticed. She had ruled long enough to understand the difference between normal silence and silence that had been created, engineered, because silence like this doesn't happen by accident. It is prepared, carefully, quietly, and always for a reason. She stood near the tall window of her chamber, looking out over the darkened kingdom. The city below was asleep, its lights dim, its people unaware that within the palace walls, something had already begun to shift. Her reflection stared back at her in the glass, calm, composed, unshaken. But behind that stillness, something else was forming, a feeling she could not yet name. Not fear, not anger, something deeper, something colder, because earlier that evening, she had heard something she was never meant to hear. Not a conversation meant for her ears, not a message delivered openly, but a fragment, a whisper that slipped through a door that wasn't fully closed. And sometimes, a single whisper is enough to destroy everything. At first, it hadn't made sense. The words were incomplete, disconnected, spoken too quickly, too carefully, as if even those speaking them were afraid of being overheard. If you're still watching, comment Queen below, because what happens next is where everything changes. But she had paused, just long enough, just close enough, to hear what mattered. It will be done before dawn. A simple sentence, but in the wrong place, at the wrong time, spoken by the wrong people. It becomes something else entirely. A warning, a decision already made, and the voices that followed confirmed it. Low, controlled, familiar, too familiar, because they belonged to people she trusted, people who stood beside her in court, people who had sworn loyalty, people who had bowed before her throne. And now, they were speaking of something that did not include her, something that would happen, without her knowing, without her approval, without her power. And in that moment, the illusion shattered, because power does not disappear suddenly. It erodes, slowly, silently, until one day you realize, it's already gone. The queen did not react immediately. She did not confront them, did not reveal that she had heard, because power, real power, is not in reaction. It is in observation, in understanding, in waiting. So she stepped away, quietly, as if nothing had changed, as if the world around her was still exactly the same. But it wasn't, because once you see betrayal, you cannot unsee it. And everything after that moment feels different. The way people look at you, the way they speak, the pauses between their words, the things they don't say. It all begins to form a pattern that only reveals itself when it's already too late. She returned to her chamber, but she did not rest, because now every thought carried weight, every memory felt incomplete, every moment of trust now felt like a mistake. Had it always been like this? Had they always been planning something? Or had something changed recently? Something she had failed to notice? These questions don't come with answers. Not immediately. They come with something else. Doubt. And doubt is far more dangerous than fear, because fear makes you act. Doubt makes you hesitate. And hesitation is exactly what her enemies were counting on. But they misunderstood one thing. They believed she was unaware. They believed she would remain passive. They believed the crown made her predictable, but they had forgotten who she was before the crown, because she had not always been queen. She had not always lived within these walls. She had not always been surrounded by rules, expectations, and controlled appearances. There was a time before all of this, a time when survival depended on instinct, on reading people, on knowing when something was wrong, before it was spoken, and that part of her had never disappeared. It had only been waiting, buried beneath years of protocol, years of forced calm, years of pretending that power meant safety. And now, that part of her was awake again, quiet, focused, dangerous, because betrayal does something to a person. It removes illusions, strips away comfort, forces clarity, and clarity is where real power begins. The queen moved through the palace later that night, not as a ruler, but as an observer. She noticed things she hadn't noticed before. Guards positioned slightly differently. Doors that were usually open now closed. Servants avoiding eye contact. Small changes. Subtle, but consistent. And consistency means intention, means planning, means this was not a single decision. This was something that had been building for a long time, and she had been at the center of it, without realizing, until now. And the more she saw, the clearer it became. This wasn't just betrayal. It was replacement. A plan not just to remove her from power, but to erase her from it. To make it seem as if she had never truly held it at all. Because the most effective way to destroy a ruler is not to kill them. It is to remove their existence from the story entirely. And that's what they were preparing to do. Before dawn. Quietly. Cleanly. Without resistance, or at least, that's what they believed, because they didn't know that the queen had already changed, that something inside her had already shifted, because betrayal does not just create victims. Sometimes, it creates something else, something far more dangerous, something that no longer follows the rules, no longer trusts the system, no longer believes in mercy, or fairness, or the idea that power should be shared. And as the night grew darker, the queen made a decision, not spoken, not written, but understood, because some decisions do not need words. They exist in silence, in intention, in the space between what was and what is about to become. She would not confront them. She would not expose the plan. She would not try to escape, because escape is for those who accept defeat. And she was not defeated. Not yet. Instead, she would wait. Watch. Let them believe everything was proceeding as planned. Let them move forward, unaware, because the most powerful position in any conflict is the one where your enemies think they've already won. And when that belief becomes certainty, that's when they are at their weakest. And that's when everything changes. The queen turned away from the window, her reflection fading into the darkness behind her. And for the first time that night, her expression shifted, not into fear, not into anger, but into something far more unsettling. Calm. A calm that does not come from peace, but from decision. Because whatever she was about to do had already begun. But the most dangerous part of that night wasn't the betrayal. It was the fact that the queen didn't try to stop it, because she was already planning something far worse, something that would not just destroy her enemies, but erase them completely. By the time the sun rose over the kingdom, nothing appeared different. The palace stood as it always had, majestic, silent, untouched. The banners still hung in perfect symmetry. The guards remained at their posts. The servants moved with the same practiced discipline. To anyone looking from the outside, it was just another day. But inside those walls, everything had already changed. Because betrayal doesn't announce itself. It hides. In routines. In familiar faces. In the quiet confidence of people who believe their plan is flawless. And that morning, the queen walked into the royal court, as if she knew nothing. Her expression was unchanged, calm, controlled, untouchable. And that was exactly what made it so dangerous. Because while everyone else believed the game had already been decided, they had no idea. She was now playing a different one. The council gathered as usual. Advisors stood in their designated places. Nobles whispered behind carefully measured smiles. The air carried a tension so subtle it could only be felt by someone who knew what to look for. And the queen was watching, not openly, not in a way that would reveal suspicion, but in silence, in observation, because once trust is broken, every detail becomes important. Every glance holds meaning. Every pause becomes a signal. And slowly, the pattern began to reveal itself. It started with a chancellor, a man who had served the crown for decades. Loyal, respected, trusted beyond question. And yet, that morning, he avoided her gaze. Only slightly, barely noticeable, but enough. Enough for someone who had ruled long enough to understand that even the smallest change is never accidental. Then there was the general, standing firm as always, his posture unchanged, his presence commanding, but his hand rested just a little too close to the hilt of his sword, not in defense, but in readiness, as if waiting for something, as if expecting a moment that had already been planned. And then, there were the others, not all of them, not everyone in the room, just enough. Enough to form a structure, a network, a silent agreement that moved beneath the surface of the court like an invisible thread, connecting them all. And the queen saw it, not all at once, but piece by piece. Because conspiracies are never revealed completely. They are uncovered through fragments, through inconsistencies, through moments that don't align with what is supposed to be normal. And this was no longer normal. The meeting proceeded as expected. Reports were given. Decisions were discussed. Voices rose and fell in controlled rhythm. But beneath it all, something else was happening. Something unspoken. Because every word that was said was carefully chosen. Every topic, deliberately safe. Nothing unexpected. Nothing that would shift the balance. Nothing that would draw attention to what was really being prepared. And that was the clearest sign of all. Because when powerful people avoid certain topics, it's not because they're unimportant. It's because they're too important to be discussed openly. And the queen understood that. So she played her role perfectly. She listened, responded, maintained the illusion that nothing had changed. Because revealing awareness too early would have destroyed everything. And she needed more. More information. More clarity. More understanding of just how deep this conspiracy went. Because this was no longer about survival. It was about control. About reclaiming something that had already been taken from her, without her even realizing it. And that requires patience. The kind of patience that only comes from knowing that time is not on your side, but can still be used against your enemies. The meeting ended without incident. No sudden moves. No confrontation. No sign that anything was wrong. And that was exactly how they wanted it. Because a perfect betrayal leaves no immediate trace. It unfolds quietly, until the moment it is too late to stop. But what they didn't realize was that moment had already passed. Because the queen was no longer reacting to their plan. She was studying it, mapping it, understanding its structure, and most importantly, identifying its weaknesses. Because every conspiracy, no matter how carefully designed, has a point where everything depends on timing, on coordination, on trust between the people involved. And trust is the easiest thing to break, especially when those who rely on it believe they are in control. As the day progressed, the queen moved through the palace with purpose, not visibly, not in a way that would draw attention, but with intent. She observed movements, tracked interactions, noticed who spoke to whom, and who avoided certain areas entirely. Because absence is just as important as presence, and the more she observed, the clearer the structure became. This wasn't just a small group of traitors. It was a system, a coordinated effort involving multiple layers. The council, the military, even parts of the royal staff, all connected, all moving toward a single moment, before dawn, just as she had heard. And that meant one thing. The plan was already in motion, too far to be stopped in the traditional sense, too complete to be dismantled directly, which meant it had to be turned, not destroyed, redirected, used against the very people who created it. Because the most effective way to defeat a conspiracy is not to expose it. It is to let it continue until it collapses under its own weight. And that requires something most rulers never have. The willingness to become something else, something they never intended to be. Because power, when threatened, does not remain pure. It changes, adapts, becomes sharper, colder, more precise. And by the time the sun began to set, the queen had already made her choice. Not just to survive, but to win. Completely. Not through defense. Not through negotiation. But through something far more final. Something that would ensure no one would ever attempt this again. Because betrayal, when left unanswered, becomes a lesson. But when answered completely, it becomes a warning. And the queen was no longer interested in lessons, only in consequences. The night approached again. And with it, the moment her enemies had been waiting for. They believed everything was ready. That every piece was in place. That by the time the next dawn arrived, the throne would no longer belong to her. And in a way, they were right. Because by the time that night ended, everything about the throne would change. Just not in the way they expected. But what they didn't realize was that while they were planning to remove the queen, she had already decided who would disappear first. And once it began, there would be no way to stop it. The first disappearance didn't feel like anything at all. No alarms. No whispers spreading through the palace. No sudden panic. Just absence. The kind that is easy to ignore. Easy to explain away. The kind that disappears into routine so quietly that no one questions it. At least not at first. Because the man who vanished that morning was not important enough to cause concern. A minor official. Someone who attended meetings, but never led them. Someone who existed within the system, but did not define it. And when he didn't appear that day, it was assumed he was delayed. By evening, it was assumed he was ill. By the next morning, it was assumed he had simply been reassigned. Because in a place like the royal palace, people come and go. Positions shift. Lives change direction without explanation. And no one asks questions, as long as everything continues to function. And that's exactly what happened. Everything continued. The court assembled. The council spoke. The guards stood. The kingdom moved forward, as if nothing had changed. But something had. Because while the disappearance meant nothing to most, to a few, it meant everything. The ones who were part of the conspiracy noticed. Not immediately. Not with certainty. But with hesitation. A small pause in their confidence. A moment where something didn't align with the plan. Because the man who vanished was not supposed to vanish. Not yet. He had a role. A purpose within the structure they had created. And when something inside a carefully planned system shifts unexpectedly, it creates doubt. And doubt spreads. Slowly. Silently. Like something moving beneath the surface. Unseen. But impossible to stop once it begins. The queen said nothing. She made no announcement. Issued no command. Showed no reaction. Because power, when used correctly, does not need to be seen. It needs to be felt. And that's exactly what she was creating. A presence. An influence. A shift that no one could explain. But everyone could sense. The second disappearance came 2 days later. This time, it was harder to ignore, because the person who vanished was not insignificant. He was connected. Involved. One of the quiet pieces of the conspiracy. Not a leader, but a participant. And when he failed to appear, the pattern became clearer. At least, to those who were paying attention. Because now, it wasn't coincidence. It wasn't routine. It was something else. Something deliberate. But still, no one spoke of it openly. Because speaking would mean acknowledging it. And acknowledging it would mean admitting that something was wrong. Something they did not understand. And in a place built on control, admitting a lack of understanding is the first step toward losing power. So they stayed silent, pretended everything was normal, continued moving forward, as if the plan was still intact. But it wasn't, because the queen was no longer observing. She was acting, quietly, precisely, and most importantly, predictably unpredictable, because the disappearances did not follow a clear pattern. They were not immediate, not connected in an obvious way. They didn't happen all at once. They happened just slowly enough to create uncertainty, just far enough apart to prevent panic, just carefully enough to make it impossible to prove anything. And that's what made it so effective, because fear does not come from what you see. It comes from what you don't understand, from what you can't explain, from what might happen next, but hasn't happened yet. And that's where the palace found itself, caught between knowledge and ignorance. aware that something was wrong, but unable to define it, because there was no evidence, no bodies, no witnesses, no trace of struggle, just people who were there one moment and gone the next. And the queen remained exactly the same, calm, controlled, unshaken, attending court, making decisions, speaking with the same measured authority she always had, as if none of it concerned her, as if none of it existed. And that was the most terrifying part, because those who were involved in the conspiracy began to understand something they hadn't considered before. She knew, not suspected, not guessed, knew, and she had known before any of them realized the plan was compromised, because only someone who understood everything could act with that level of precision, that level of control, that level of silence. And once that realization took hold, everything changed, because now the balance of power had shifted completely. They were no longer the ones in control. They were no longer the ones deciding what would happen. They were now part of something else, something they didn't create, something they didn't understand, something they couldn't stop. And the worst part was not knowing when it would reach them, because the disappearances were selective, intentional, each one removing a piece of the structure they had built, but never enough to collapse it immediately. Because this wasn't about destruction. Not yet. This was about fear, about breaking them from the inside, because a system built on trust cannot survive once that trust is gone. And one by one, that trust began to disappear. Just like the people, conversations became shorter, glances became sharper, alliances became uncertain, because no one knew who would be next. No one knew if the person standing beside them would still be there tomorrow. And that uncertainty destroyed everything faster than any direct attack ever could. Because fear makes people act irrationally. It makes them question each other. If this story made you question history, subscribe now. Because the truth you're looking for is never the one you're told. Doubt each other. Turn against each other. And that's exactly what began to happen. Quietly, subtly, but undeniably, the conspiracy was collapsing. Not from the outside, but from within. And the queen had done nothing visible to cause it, because she didn't need to. She had already set everything in motion. Days passed, then weeks, and by the time anyone realized what was truly happening, it was already too late, because the structure they had built no longer existed in its original form. It had been dismantled, piece by piece, without confrontation, without resistance, without a single public act of power. And that was what made it so terrifying, because this wasn't revenge in the traditional sense. There were no executions, no declarations, no visible punishments, just silence and absence, and the slow realization that something far more calculated was unfolding, because the queen was no longer just protecting her throne. She was sending a message that did not need to be spoken, because everyone understood it. You were not safe. Not because you were guilty, but because she had decided you were. And that decision was final. But the most terrifying part wasn't the disappearances. It was the fact that the queen wasn't finished yet, because what she had planned next wouldn't just remove her enemies, it would expose them, and make sure no one would ever forget what happens when a queen is betrayed. By the time the final phase began, there was nothing left to stop it. The conspiracy that had once stretched quietly through the palace, linking powerful men through whispers and secret agreements, had already begun to fracture. Not because it had been exposed, not because it had been confronted, but because it had been understood. Completely. Every name, every role, every hidden connection. The queen had seen all of it. And now, she was ready to end it. Not with noise, not with chaos, but with precision. Because true power does not destroy blindly. It removes exactly what it intends to. The court assembled that morning as it always had. Nothing outwardly different. No sign that anything extraordinary was about to happen. And that was the brilliance of it. Because the people who walked into that room still believed they were part of something. Still believed they had influence. Still believed they had a future beyond that day. They did not yet understand that this would be the last time they stood there. The queen entered slowly, measured, composed, her presence unchanged. But the atmosphere shifted the moment she stepped forward. It wasn't something that could be seen, not something that could be explained, but it was felt. A weight, a silence that settled over the room, not out of respect, but out of something else, something closer to instinct, because somewhere, deep beneath their confidence, something inside them had begun to recognize the truth. Too late. The proceedings began as usual. Reports, discussions, voices speaking in controlled tones. But beneath the structure, something was building, because this time, the queen was not observing. She was guiding, subtly, carefully, leading the conversation in directions that seemed natural, but were anything but. Questions that appeared routine, but carried deeper meaning. Requests for clarification that forced certain individuals to speak, to reveal just enough, to confirm what she already knew, because the final stage of any plan is not action, it is certainty, and she needed them to confirm it themselves, to stand there, in front of her, and unknowingly expose their roles, their connections, their involvement, and they did, one by one, without realizing, because they believed the danger had passed. They believed the disappearances had ended. They believed whatever had been happening was behind them, but it wasn't. It had only been preparing. And now, it was complete. The room fell quiet, not gradually, but suddenly, because the queen stopped speaking. And when she did, no one else dared to continue. That silence was different, heavier, final, because this time, it wasn't the silence of control. It was the silence of decision. And then, she gave the signal. Not a command, not a word, just a movement, small, almost unnoticeable, but enough, because the guards responded instantly. Doors closed, not loudly, not dramatically, but with finality, and in that moment, everything changed, because the people in that room finally understood, not fully, not clearly, but enough to know. This was not part of the plan. This was something else, something they had not accounted for, something they could not control. The first reaction was confusion, not panic, not yet, because power does not collapse immediately. It resists, tries to reassert itself, tries to regain control of the situation. But control was no longer theirs, because the queen stood at the center of it all, completely still, completely calm, and that calm was more terrifying than anything else, because it meant one thing. This had been planned, every detail, every movement, every second, and there was nothing left to stop it. The accusations did not come. There were no speeches, no declarations of guilt, because she did not need to explain anything. She did not need to justify what was about to happen, because truth was no longer part of the equation, only consequence. The guards moved with precision, not aggressively, not violently, but with certainty. Each step calculated, each action controlled, and one by one, the individuals who had once believed themselves untouchable were removed from their positions, not dragged, not forced, but taken, as if this had always been inevitable, as if this moment had been waiting for them. Some tried to speak, to protest, to demand explanation, but their voices carried no weight, because power is not in words, it is in who is allowed to act. And in that room, only one person still held it. The queen did not raise her voice, did not show anger, did not express satisfaction, because this was not about emotion. This was about completion, about finishing something that had already begun the moment she heard that first whisper in the corridor. And now, it was ending, exactly as she intended. But the true impact of what she had done was not in that room, not in the removal of those individuals, not in the collapse of the conspiracy. It was in what came after, because the revenge did not stop there. It expanded, beyond the court, beyond the palace, into every layer of the system that had allowed the betrayal to exist. Quiet investigations, silent replacements, records altered, connections erased. Not just the people, but the structure itself, dismantled, rebuilt, reshaped into something that could never be used against her again, because she understood something most rulers never do. Eliminating enemies is not enough. You must eliminate the possibility of new ones forming, and that requires something deeper than punishment. It requires transformation. And that's exactly what she created. A system that did not rely on trust. A system that did not depend on loyalty. A system that operated on something else entirely. Control. Absolute. Unquestioned. Unbreakable. Because after that day, no one in the kingdom doubted her power. Not because they had seen it, but because they had felt it. In the silence that followed. In the absence of those who had once stood beside them. In the understanding that what happened could happen again. At any time. To anyone. Without warning. Without explanation. Without resistance. And that fear was stronger than any army. Stronger than any law. Stronger than any crown. Because it lived inside them. Constant. Unavoidable. And that was her true victory. Not the removal of her enemies, but the creation of something far more lasting. A kingdom that would never dare to betray her again. But the most disturbing part wasn't how the queen destroyed her enemies. It was how history later described it, because what we know about her reign today is not what actually happened. When the dust settled, there was no record of what truly happened. No official account of that morning. No detailed explanation of the sudden disappearances. No mention of the moment when the balance of power shifted completely, and the queen took control in a way no ruler before her ever had. Instead, there was silence, carefully placed, carefully maintained, because history, as it is written, does not always reflect what happened. It reflects what was allowed to be remembered, and in this case, very little was allowed to survive. The official records described a different story, a cleaner one. A version where the queen faced minor political unrest and handled it with strength and wisdom. A version where stability was restored quickly, where loyalty was reaffirmed, where the kingdom moved forward without disruption. There was no mention of fear, no mention of absence, no mention of the quiet terror that had settled over the palace, long before the rest of the world even realized something had changed. Because fear does not translate well into official documents. It cannot be measured, cannot be justified, cannot be explained without exposing the truth behind it. And the truth behind it was never meant to be written. The names of those who disappeared were removed, not crossed out, not marked as deceased, just gone, as if they had never held their positions, as if they had never stood in that court, as if they had never existed at all. And that kind of removal is far more powerful than destruction, because destruction leaves evidence. Erasure leaves nothing, nothing to question, nothing to investigate, nothing to remember. And without memory, there is no truth, only the version that remains. The queen's reign, in the years that followed, was described as stable, strong, even admired. Historians would later write about her as a decisive ruler, someone who maintained order during uncertain times, someone who understood the importance of control and exercised it effectively. But those descriptions were incomplete, because they only reflected what could be safely said, not what was actually felt, not what people experienced in those days, following the disappearances. Because stability, when built on fear, feels very different from stability built on trust. It is quieter, more rigid, less forgiving, and far more permanent. Because fear does not fade easily. It embeds itself in behavior, in decisions, in the way people choose to act, even when no one is watching. And that was the true legacy of the queen. Not just the revenge, not just the removal of her enemies, but the transformation of the entire system into something that no longer required open force. Because once fear becomes internal, it enforces itself. And that is the most efficient form of control. The kingdom changed after that, not visibly, not in ways that could be easily identified, but in structure, in tone, in the way power was understood. Because after that moment, power was no longer seen as something shared, or negotiated, or influenced. It was absolute, and absolute power does not tolerate uncertainty, which meant that over time, even the memory of what had happened began to fade, not because people forgot, but because they chose not to remember. Because remembering would mean acknowledging something they could not change, something they could not challenge, something they could not even fully understand. And so, it became easier to accept the official version, to believe that everything had happened the way it was written, to move forward without questioning what might have been left out, because questioning leads to doubt, and doubt, in a system built on absolute control, is dangerous. Not just for those who ask the questions, but for those who hear them. And that's how the truth disappears. Not all at once, but slowly, quietly, until it becomes something else entirely. A possibility, a rumor, a fragment that doesn't quite fit into the accepted narrative, but isn't strong enough to replace it. And that's exactly what happened here. The real story of the Queen's revenge was never told directly. It survived only in pieces, in inconsistencies, in small gaps between official records, in the absence of information where there should have been detail. And for most people, that absence meant nothing. But for those who looked closely, it meant everything. Because absence, when it appears repeatedly, is not accidental. It is intentional. And intentional absence is a form of control, a way of shaping reality without changing it visibly, a way of guiding perception without revealing the truth. And once you recognize that, you begin to see it everywhere, not just in this story, but in others. Moments in history that feel incomplete, events that seem too simple for their impact, leaders whose actions don't fully align with their reputation. Because what we are given is rarely the full picture. It is a version, a constructed narrative designed to be understood easily, accepted quickly, and rarely questioned. And the Queen understood that better than anyone, because she didn't just win. She controlled the aftermath. She ensured that what happened that day would never be fully known, that even if pieces of the truth survived, they would never be enough to reconstruct the whole. Because the most effective way to hide something is not to destroy it. It is to fragment it, to break it into parts so small that no one can see how they connect. And that's exactly what she did, which leads to the most unsettling realization of all. What if the story we know is only one version? What if the Queen we remember is not the one who truly existed? What if the ruler described in history books is just the surface, while something far more complex, far more ruthless, remains hidden beneath it? Because if a single event can be altered this completely, if an entire act of revenge can be reduced to a footnote, then how many other truths have been reshaped the same way? How many stories have been simplified until they no longer reflect reality? How many moments in history have been rewritten to remove what was too uncomfortable to accept? And that's where the story truly ends. Not with the Queen, not with the revenge, not even with the silence that followed, but with a question that lingers long after everything else fades. What if the most important parts of history are the ones we were never meant to see? Because if her revenge was powerful enough to reshape the narrative itself, then the real story is not what she did. It's what was done to make sure we would never fully understand it. Because the Queen didn't just destroy her enemies, she destroyed the truth of what she became and replaced it with a version the world could accept, while the real story remained buried somewhere between silence and memory. In the end, the Queen was never defeated, but she was never truly understood either. Because what happened inside those palace walls was never meant to become history. It was meant to become silence. A silence so complete, so controlled that over time, it would feel natural, as if nothing unusual had ever happened, as if the sudden disappearances, the shift in power, the quiet fear that once lived in every corridor were nothing more than imagination. And that is how the truth disappears, not through destruction, but through replacement, because the version of the Queen that survived was not the one who stood in that court and ended everything. It was a version that could be accepted, a ruler described as strong, wise, decisive, not ruthless, not calculated, not capable of turning an entire system against itself without ever raising her voice. Because that version of her was too dangerous to remember, too unsettling to preserve. So it was softened, edited, reshaped into something history could carry without breaking. But the real Queen did not disappear. She remained, not in records, not in official accounts, but in the space between them, in the missing names, in the unexplained gaps, in the silence that follows moments that should have been louder. Because silence, when it repeats, becomes a pattern, and patterns reveal more than words ever can. Because if nothing had happened, there would be nothing to hide. And if everything was as simple as it was written, there would be no need to remove so much. But they did remove it. Carefully. Completely. Which means there was something worth hiding. Something powerful enough to reshape the narrative itself. And that is where the true weight of the story lies. Not in the revenge, not in the betrayal, but in what came after. Because the queen didn't just win. She controlled what winning looked like. She decided what the world would remember, and what it would never even question. And that level of control is far more dangerous than any act of violence, because it doesn't just change the present, it rewrites the past. And once the past is rewritten, everything built on it becomes uncertain. Because if one truth can be altered, then all truths can be questioned. And that is the part history never tells you. That what you know is not always what happened. It is what remained after everything else was removed. And the queen understood that better than anyone, because she didn't just eliminate her enemies. She eliminated the version of events in which they ever had power. She turned their existence into something that could not be proven, something that could not be remembered clearly, something that could not challenge her again. And in doing so, she created something far more lasting than fear. She created certainty, a certainty so absolute that no one would ever dare to question it, because questioning requires evidence, and she made sure there was none. But absence is its own form of evidence, for those who are willing to see it, because when you look closely, the story doesn't fully align. There are gaps, moments where something feels missing, places where the narrative moves too quickly, as if skipping over something important. And those moments are not mistakes. They are traces, remnants of something that was once there, and was deliberately removed. And that leads to the final question, not about the queen, not about her revenge, but about everything that came after. Because if a single ruler could reshape history this completely, if she could turn truth into silence, and silence into accepted reality, then how much of what we know today is built on the same foundation? How many stories have been simplified until they no longer reflect what actually happened? How many truths have been buried, not in the ground, but in the way they were told? Because the most powerful control is not over people. It is over perception, over what is believed, over what is remembered, and over what is quietly forgotten. And that is the legacy of the queen. Not just a reign of power, but a reign of control so complete that even centuries later, we are still living inside the version of her story that she chose to leave behind. Because in the end, the queen didn't just take revenge on her enemies. She took control of the truth itself and made sure that the world would never know what she really became.